For more on this, we welcome Helena Varkkey, Associate Professor of Environmental Politics and Governance at Universiti Malaya. Professor, if we can start with air quality, what are the biggest concerns for a world that's increasingly on fire?
So, air quality is, of course, as mentioned just now, one of the worst threats to our well-being because it's a cause of so many different types of health concerns. And even though we're talking about haze today, but haze is acute, so it comes and goes. So even though it's really bad, it spikes for a few weeks. But then we also have to be concerned about the ambient or the baseline air quality. And in Southeast Asia itself, there's a lot of cities that are consistently on the top of the list, like Chiang Mai, Bangkok, Kuala Lumpur. And if you look at it from a human rights perspective, actually clean air should be a human right because without clean air, we're not able to enjoy good health, freedom of movement, and a good environment. So keeping PM 2.5 levels year-round low should be a great priority for all governments.
What is the impact of haze-related air pollution in terms of dollars, Professor? How do these small particles translate into economic losses, and which sectors are particularly affected?
So for our part of the world, we are very reliant on tourism. So this is one of the major areas that are being affected, especially when the air pollution causes closures of things like airports and railways, and also for trade as well, when it impacts our trading lines as well. But other than that, it's also really affecting in terms of when you have closures. So for example, when you have school closures, because it's just too dangerous for kids to go to school, you would have situations where parents are unable to go to work as well. So they would have to stay back. And sometimes the advisory is also to stop working outdoors. So this will stop us from being as productive as before. So we talk about lost man hours or lost man days. And of course, the spike in medical costs. This means that people who may already be pressed for cash will have to spend cash that they don't have to go to the doctor or to buy masks or to spend additional money in the pharmacy. So all this cumulatively will really cost more and impact the economy.
And Professor, the pollution from these fires often appears to be taking a bigger toll on low-income nations. And what do you put that down to?
So for low-income nations, it's similar to what we saw during COVID, where, of course, haze is a public health issue. So you would have pressures on the public health system. So low-income countries tend to have less doctors, they tend to have less budget for medical emergencies. So when this is the case, of course, it will be difficult for these low-income countries to handle the increased pressure on their medical services. So that's one thing. The other thing is there's also quite interesting impacts in terms of socioeconomic status. So we can see that the lower income communities are the ones who are less able to protect themselves from haze effectively. So like the masks that you're supposed to use, which is the N95 masks, they are the more expensive one compared to our surgical masks. And those that cannot afford will not be able to protect themselves well when they are outdoors. Those who have lower income also cannot likely have houses that can be able to be sealed effectively against the haze. They probably don't live or work in air-conditioned homes or offices, and they are likely less able to afford air purifiers. So these are the various impacts for low-income communities and countries.
I was reading through some of the articles you've written, and you've described the haze as a uniquely ASEAN problem, and you linked it to patronage politics. Can you unpack that for us?
So with how the haze comes about in southern Southeast Asia, at least, is because that there is unsustainable land use change, mainly in our peatlands. And peatlands are generally protected because they are a very important sensitive ecosystem, especially for as a carbon sink. But however, sometimes these peatlands are opened up, they are licensed when they're not supposed to be. This is usually because, certain groups of people are well connected, they are able to get access to these lands. But that is in itself not really the key point. But the key point is that these peatlands are really sensitive, so that when they are opened up, if they're not done in a very careful manner, they can be very, very flammable. They are very fire prone. So for example, peatlands are usually flooded throughout the year. So normally it is very hard for peatlands to catch fire. But what happens when you have agricultural development on peatlands? Usually the first step is to drain them. So when you drain them, all of these really carbon-rich material in the peat soil are suddenly exposed to the air, and they dry up really quickly. And when they do dry up, even though there may not be many instances of actual fire being struck anymore in these lands, because there's so much more attention on it, there's so much more awareness about why you shouldn't be using fire methods to clear land. But the ecosystem itself has dried out, it's unbalanced. So you would have situations where it's really sensitive and fires really easily break out. So even when you do have plantations or concessions that take care of their lands, be careful about the water levels and all that, the landscape itself that is so disturbed, that is so sensitive, at any time could be very flammable. And when you have situations like now, which is really dry, fires can break out even with the best of precautions.
Now, haze from wildfires doesn't just impact the country of its origin. It doesn't respect boundaries, as we've seen with Malaysia and Indonesia's recent squabble. How can countries affected by it hold parties in other countries to account and even prevent it?
So this is the challenge that a lot of the countries in Southeast Asia are facing right now, because it is a transboundary issue, but the legislation or the legal arm of the law does not go across the borders. So Singapore has put into place their Singapore Transboundary Haze Act, but due to the limited effectiveness, because even though it is a transboundary act, Singapore does need the cooperation of Indonesia for things like evidence sharing, like extradition. So this has not been forthcoming. So it has been limited in its effectiveness. So I think what countries still can do is to try and have some sort of legal reach, but to at the same time be very careful and aware of the sensitivities, the political sensitivities involved. So like, for example, Malaysia has been exploring the Transboundary Haze Act of their own, even though it's kind of put on the back burner now. Some of the suggestions and some of the angles that has been discussed is maybe to limit this to only Malaysian companies operating in, let's say, Indonesia. So to really just limit this coverage to be responsible for your own companies, wherever they may be. So you don't really cross any toes or step on any toes, but at the same time trying to be a bit more responsible and a bit more have a good check and balance system for your own entities all over the region, so that they don't cause, they are not explicit to haze.
It seems like haze is getting worse. Is it really? Should we expect more frequent, more intense spells, Professor?
Yeah, so the thing with haze is that there's quite a close link to climate change. So because I talked about peatlands just now, they are a very carbon-rich environment. So when there are fires in these peatlands, what gets released is actually huge amounts of carbon. So when these amounts of carbon go into the air, they are contributing to climate change. They are making climate change worse. And when you do have climate change, you also will have longer droughts, drier periods of time, and this will actually increase the risk of fires, because when there is dry weather, when there is prolonged drought, it's harder for the rains to, come and help us to put out these fires. So that's sort of the vicious cycle that is involved. So I think over time, if we don't handle it, there will be this increasingly worse situation, which is sort of fueled by climate change as well.
Now, we've talked quite a bit about the impact on humans, the politics of it as well. But what about the longer term impact on ecosystems? Are we paying enough attention to that?
Yeah, so definitely, I think, like I mentioned, climate change is an important environmental impact to this. And I think governments can definitely pay more attention to this. The difference is that haze is seasonal, it comes and goes. So it's not consistently in our psyche or in our thinking. But for climate change, it is constant. But actually, there is this continuous link, like I explained. And of course, they also have other environmental impacts. So, for example, like biodiversity is threatened. Peatlands are very rich biodiverse areas. So when you have fires, you are, of course, affecting the biodiversity there. And biodiversity, of course, is a very important sort of anchor for our whole environment. And when you have a lot of PM 2.5, you have a lot of particles in the air, you would also affect things like sunlight penetration. And there has been times in the past where whole crops have failed because of haze. So for in Malaysia, there has been a time when our paddy crops has failed. So these are some of the environmental effects.
A lot of your work, it focuses on governance in this realm. What needs to change in the near future to ensure greater cooperation and greater commitment to solve this problem?
Yeah, so ASEAN has a lot of frameworks in place for haze cooperation and haze governance. So I think we need to continue working towards operationalizing the aspects of the frameworks that has not been put into place. One of the really important things that I think can be prioritized fairly soon is data. What do you call this? The usage of data across the region, data uniformity. So, for example, now there is all of this data around, but then it's not the same. So, for Johor Bahru and Singapore, for example, we would have different scores of API and PSI. So, it's hard for the region to have a unified understanding of how bad the haze actually is. So things like air pollution can be standardized, air pollution indexes, and also things like the meteorological impacts of haze. So, for example, Singapore is in a good position because it has the ASEAN Specialized Meteorological Center, where a lot of information about movement of the air around the region is centralized. However, there is still some coordination problem between the ASMC and also national level meteorological centers. So this, I think, needs to be worked out. And I think ASEAN does have frameworks for it, but the operationalization has not been worked out yet. So I think this is something of priority that should be focused on as we move forward.
All right. Thank you so much for your time and for your deep insight in this topic. Helena Varkkey, Associate Professor of Environmental Politics and Governance at Universiti Malaya.